Imagine the biggest stage in world football, 80,000 people, the eyes of a planet locked onto a single match. And in the middle of it all, a man who had been written off, doubted, and quietly dismissed by some of the most powerful figures in the game, standing in the penalty area of the Azteca Stadium in Mexico City, about to do something that would define not just his career, but his entire identity as a footballer. It was 1986, England versus Poland, the World Cup, and Gary Lineker, a striker from Leicester who had been told more than once that he wasn't quite good enough for the very highest level, was about to answer every single one of his critics in the most devastating way imaginable. But here's what most people don't remember about that tournament, what they don't talk about. The weeks before that tournament, Gary Lineker had walked into the England camp under the shadow of real, genuine uncertainty. His manager had doubts, the press had questions, and somewhere deep inside, so did he. This is a story of the man who never received a single red or yellow card in his entire professional career, and yet somehow became one of the most controversial and consequential figures English football has ever produced. Gary Winston Lineker was born on the 30th of November 1960, in Leicester, a city that has always had a complicated relationship with football greatness, either producing it quietly or watching it leave through the back door. His father Barry ran a market stall, and from the very earliest days, Gary was a child who understood something fundamental about hard work and presentation. His family wasn't wealthy, but they were proud, principled, and deeply rooted in the kind of English working-class dignity that doesn't ask for sympathy. As a boy, Gary was obsessed, not just with football, with the specific geometry of goal-scoring. He would watch strikers on television, and instead of admiring the skill or the drama, he would study the angles, the timing, the runs, where a striker was before the ball was played, not after. While other kids chased the ball, Gary was already thinking about where it was going to land. That instinct, that almost supernatural spatial intelligence was something no coach had given him, and no coach could take away. He joined the Leicester City youth system as a teenager, and this is where the story starts to get interesting, because Gary Lineker was not, by traditional standards, a spectacular talent in the conventional sense. He wasn't the kid who left defenders on the ground with flicks and dummies. He wasn't physically imposing. He wasn't the type to arrive at a training ground and immediately silence a room. What he had was something quieter and in many ways more dangerous, an almost clinical understanding of space, timing, and the psychology of goalkeeping. His early coaches at Leicester were impressed but not overwhelmed. There was a feeling, one that would follow Lineker for years, that he was very good, but perhaps not transcendent. That he was a fine footballer, but not the kind who changes the course of games through sheer force of personality. What those early assessments missed completely was that Gary Lineker didn't need to change games through personality. He changed them through precision. He broke into the Leicester first team in 1978, and the journey that followed was one of steady, almost methodical accumulation. Goals, appearances, consistency. While the English football world of the early 1980s was still dominated by bruising physical battles, by wingers and midfield generals and deep-lying playmakers, Lineker was quietly perfecting something different. He was becoming, almost invisibly, one of the purest penalty box strikers the English game had ever seen. But football has never been kind to quiet excellence. And the criticism came. The criticism came. There were journalists who wrote, with considerable confidence, that Lineker was a flat-track bully, a player who scored against lesser opposition but disappeared in the biggest matches. There were fans who questioned whether his style was too passive, too reactive, too dependent on the work of others. Even within Leicester's dressing room, there were questions about whether the quiet, clean-living lad from the market could really be the player to carry a club's ambitions. He didn't drink heavily with the lads. He didn't engage in the kind of loud, territorial dressing room performances that English football culture often mistook for leadership. He was, by all accounts, polite, reserved, thoughtful. In the brutal social ecosystem of a professional football club in 1980s England, being thoughtful was not always considered a virtue. But what happened next shocked everyone who had written him off. In the 1984-85 season, Gary Lineker scored 24 league goals for Leicester City, a performance so emphatic, so ruthlessly consistent, that it was impossible to ignore. Everton came calling. And with one transfer, the trajectory of his career changed completely. Goodison Park in the mid-1980s was one of the most intense football environments in England. Howard Kendall had built something extraordinary, a team of genuine quality, aggression, and collective identity. And into that cauldron walked Gary Lineker, still carrying the whispers that followed him from Leicester. Still, being measured against a standard that he hadn't quite been accepted as meeting. He spent only one season at Everton, just one, and he scored 30 goals. 30 goals in a single season. The Football Writers Association named him their Footballer of the Year, and then, almost immediately, Barcelona came calling. Not Everton, not another English club, Barcelona, Johan Cruyff's Barcelona. Think about what that means for a moment. A boy from a Leicester market stall, a striker who had been called too nice, too quiet, too passive, being pursued by one of the greatest clubs in the history of world football, to play under one of the greatest footballing minds who ever lived. The world was starting to understand what Gary Lineker had always known about himself. But between the Everton chapter and the Barcelona chapter sits the most important moment of Gary Lineker's footballing life. The 1986 World Cup in Mexico. England arrived in Mexico as a team in complicated shape. Bobby Robson, the manager, was under enormous pressure from the English press, a media environment that, even by its own impressive standards of cruelty, had reached a particular level of ferocity. The tabloids were calling for Robson's head. The team's performances in warm-up matches had been unconvincing, and Lineker, despite his extraordinary domestic season, had not yet fully convinced the football world that he was an international-level striker. The opening group game against Portugal ended in defeat. Lineker barely touched the ball. Robson was publicly eviscerated by the press. And behind the scenes, something very different was unfolding, a quiet, private crisis of confidence within the squad, a sense that this World Cup might end in humiliation. Then came Poland, and Gary Lineker scored a hat. 3 goals, clinical, precise, each one a masterclass in movement, timing and composure, each one a direct refutation of every doubt that had ever been attached to his name. The Azteca Stadium shook. England were alive, and Gary Lineker had arrived on the world stage in the most dramatic way imaginable. What followed over the next 2 weeks was remarkable. He scored 2 more against Paraguay. He scored against Argentina, yes, in that match. The one that also produced the other goal, the infamous one from Maradona that the world could not stop talking about. England lost. They were going home. But Gary Lineker finished as the tournament's top scorer with 6 goals. The Golden Boot. At a World Cup, the boy from Leicester had become the most celebrated striker in the world. Barcelona was everything and nothing that he expected. Cruyff's system demanded a different kind of intelligence from a centre-forward, more pressing, more involvement in build-up play, more sacrifice, and Lineker, to his enormous credit, adapted. He wasn't always the automatic first choice. There were tensions, the polite, disciplined English striker navigating the complex political and cultural universe of Spanish football. There were games where he felt marginalized, moments where the language barrier was about more than just words, but the goals kept coming, and the reputation kept growing. He returned to England with Tottenham Hotspur in 1989, and in many ways this was the most emotionally complete chapter of his career. Back home, playing for a club that appreciated flair and intelligence, working under Terry Venables, a manager who understood exactly how to use him, he formed a partnership with Paul Gascoigne that was, in its brief flowering, one of the most exciting attacking combinations English club football had ever seen. The 1990 World Cup in Italy added another layer to the legend. England reached the semi-finals, and in that agonizing semi-finale against West Germany, as the nation held its breath, Gary Lineker equalized with a goal of such calm authority that it temporarily stopped time. England would lose on penalties. Gascoigne would cry. A nation would grieve. But Lineker had once again delivered when it mattered most. By the time the 1992 European Championships arrived, Gary Lineker sat on 48 international goals for England, one behind Bobby Charlton's all-time record. And what happened in that tournament remains one of the most debated decisions in English football history. Manager Graham Taylor substituted Lineker during a crucial group match against Sweden, removing him from the pitch and from any possibility of equaling that record at what felt like the worst possible moment. England went out, the record stayed out of reach, and the relationship between Lineker and Taylor was, by any assessment, poisonous. There are those who have called Taylor's decision tactical. There are those who have called it personal. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in that murky territory where football management and human ego overlap in ways that history rarely fully illuminates. What is beyond dispute is that Gary Lineker, England's all-time second-highest scorer, walked away from international football without the farewell his career deserved. But here is what makes Gary Lineker's story ultimately different from almost every story in football. He didn't crumble. He didn't become bitter, or if he did, he converted that bitterness into fuel for an entirely new chapter. Because after football, Gary Lineker became something that no one had quite anticipated. He became a broadcaster of genuine quality, a voice, a presence, a public intellectual with a platform and the courage, and it did require courage to use it. His decades as the face of BBC's Match of the Day transformed him from a celebrated footballer into a cultural institution. And when, in recent years, he chose to use that platform to speak publicly about political issues, about values, about fairness, about the treatment of vulnerable people, the controversy that followed was perhaps the most intense of his entire life. The debate about whether a public broadcaster should voice political opinions, the suspension, the solidarity from colleagues, the public argument about freedom of expression in modern Britain. Whatever you believe about that debate, whatever side of it you stand on, you cannot deny this. Gary Lineker has spent his entire life doing things that people told him were impossible, scoring goals when they said he couldn't, succeeding at the highest level when they doubted him, building a second career when most footballers disappeared, and speaking his mind when silence would have been far more comfortable. The boy who grew up on the streets around a Leicester market stall. The striker who was too nice, too clean, too quiet. The man who played his entire career without a single booking in the most physically and emotionally brutal sport on earth, and somehow ended up more controversial than players who left a trail of red cards behind them. Gary Lineker never needed to be dirty. He never needed to be cruel. He scored 48 goals for England, won a World Cup Golden Boot, succeeded at Barcelona, and spent 30 years as one of the most recognized faces in British broadcasting, all while refusing to compromise who he was. Some players are remembered for what they did. Gary Lineker is remembered for who he was while he did it. And in the long and complicated history of English football, that might be the rarest achievement of all.